Thanks too. Good morning. Being a Creative Mornings presenter just comes with a barrage of like strange off-kilter questions. And so it's sort of fun to answer them in all different ways. Yeah, please do Google Silly Point. It is the place where your cricket coach places you when he doesn't like who you are. I spent 3 years as a kid in the United Kingdom, and it was interesting being a Canadian in a boys' school in England in the early 1980s. So I want to talk about home. I want to talk about creativity, and I want to talk about responsibility and who we are. Many of you will know, many of you are Canadian on this call, and many of you will know that over the last month, in the public discourse, we've been going through an incredible moment, a historical moment related to the discovery of the unmarked graves of thousands now of children who were buried in the grounds of residential schools across this country. And we've only began scratching the surface and looking for many, many more of these unmarked graves. These are not stories that were unknown in Canada, but they were known mostly in Indigenous communities. And yeah, the orange shirt there is a mark of solidarity with Indigenous residential school survivors. And one of the things that was like a really profound moment in the last couple of weeks, actually this last week here in Canada, was that Canada Day wasn't so much celebrated as it was commemorated this year. You saw many, many more people wearing orange, marching in solidarity with residential school survivors than you did see people wearing red and white. There was a very muted patriotism. And when I was explaining this to my friends in the United States this past week, it was, they couldn't kind of wrap their heads around it, because these patriotic holidays are supposed to be about celebrating our great country and our home and where we are and everything. And I think we're beginning to reckon with the idea that our home may be on somebody else's territories, if you haven't already realized it, but in a profound way. So most of my work over the past 35 years has actually been working in the space between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I began that journey in 1986 when I was an 18-year-old delegate to the General Council of the United Church of Canada. So I was a voting delegate, probably one of the youngest people in that room. And that was 600 or so of us gathered from across the country. And that was a significant General Council meeting because in 1986, the United Church began to be was the first church to apologize to Indigenous communities and congregations and populations for colonization and for the fervent destruction of Indigenous spirituality. And what was brilliant about that moment was that this was an effort that was brought by Indigenous elders to the church. They said they wanted to create an apology. And I hold my hands up to people like Alberta Billy from Likoltacha on Vancouver Island, Murray Wheatung from Curve Lake in Ontario, Stan Mackay, and people like Art Solomon and others who drove this process for the United Church and made it happen. So that over 2 years, there was a big conversation about what we should do and how we should go about this. And finally, we came up with the wording for an apology. And the night that the apology was made, the moderator of the United Church, the elected leader of the United Church, delivered the apology to the elders who were sitting in a teepee in a parking lot in Sudbury, where we were gathered around a sacred fire. And they spoke for what seemed like hours. And when they emerged, the elders said that they acknowledged the apology, but they didn't accept it or forgive people. And I thought it was brilliant, actually. It was brilliant to acknowledge it and not to accept it. What they said was, we'll see what you do. We'll see what you do. There may come a time when we accept and forgive, but just because you've apologized doesn't mean that. And that's actually what changed my life. That moved me into studying. I went to Trent University, studied Indigenous studies. And after many years working with Indigenous organizations like friendship centers and many different human service organizations, kind of honed my chops as a facilitator and honed my chops working a lot in this space between where Indigenous systems and non-Indigenous systems interact: child and family services, land, economic development, governance, human services. Everything from crises to long-term strategic work, and always constantly learning and understanding who I was and what my role was and what my responsibilities were as a settler in these territories. So at some level, what's happened over the last couple of weeks has been a really profound piece for me because it's felt like a lot of my life has sort of collided in this moment. And I've been able to host conversations with settlers that I've never been able to have before. We've been engaged in giving land back to First Nations that I could never dream that we would ever do such a thing. And suddenly it's happening all around us. So there's a poignant moment here. And so when you're asked to talk about home, you know, like, I think we really need to confront where we live and really understand where we live, and really, as creative people and as change makers, really understand what we can contribute to this conversation and what we can contribute to the deeper requirement that is asked of us to make Canada the land that it so beautifully potentially embodies, but so poorly executes. So I believe that creative people have a role to play, and I want to talk about that a little bit here. I have ancestors that are buried in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and in the Grey Bruce Highlands of Ontario. And when most of my family emigrated to Canada in the 1870s, between the 1850s and the 1870s. And it's interesting to me that when they came to Canada, they actually brought the names with them. So a lot of the places where people live in Southern Ontario were named after the Scottish and Irish places where they had left from. And that's an interesting piece to me, because it suggests to me that even when we leave our homes, we leave the places in which we have been Indigenous, we seem to want to take those places with us and impose them on the new land to kind of give us a sense of home, give us a feeling of something familiar. But of course, the place where they traveled to weren't empty. These weren't empty places. It's not an empty continent. There are people and nations who have lived here for thousands and thousands of years. There are names on the landscape that matter, names that convey with them a deep sense of home and connection. And when my ancestors arrived, they just erased them and replaced them with names of places in Scotland and Ireland. So it's interesting when you start thinking about, for settlers, what does home mean? What does belonging mean? And this is a particularly interesting thing for me about North America. Because when you travel in Europe, you're largely traveling through Indigenous nations. You know, when you meet English people, as I did when I played Silly Point for the cricket team at Richard Hale School in Hartford, you're meeting people whose families have been in England for thousands and thousands of years, you know. But here, settlers are all immigrants, and it doesn't matter why you came or when you came here. There's something about the sense of home that happens in North America that's a little bit different, I think. Well, it's very different from how Indigenous people feel it. I have a friend who's a freshwater scientist in Montreal, and she runs the biological station for the University of Montreal in the Laurentians, and it's a really beautiful place. And as a climate scientist, she's really in awe of the kinds of conversations that me and my colleagues get to lead with social innovators and people making change. And they're really engaging. People come to these conversations to try and create new worlds, to create new possibilities and new things. And it makes her really jealous, because as a climate scientist, she's always wanting to try and get people to talk about her science, to talk about her data, because she has the answers, she has the information we need around climate that we need to be able to talk about. But scientists don't always do the best job in convening. And so we've worked together over the years in teaching and learning and exploring different convening methods and different ways of being in dialogue with each other. But she comes to the table also with a gift. She has a bee in her bonnet about social innovation. And the bee in her bonnet she has is that we have a very colonial mindset to creativity on this continent. We kind of dream and we think, oh, we can do whatever we want. We can create a thing and then we can scale it. We can take it to scale. We can make impact. And Roxanne is sitting on the sidelines screaming about, are you even aware of the biophysical constraints of your creativity, right? It's beautiful to be able to dream and to create anything you want. And the resources we use to do that are harvested from stolen lands. The carrying capacity of the systems that we live in can't possibly carry all this hope and possibility. We need to be able to talk better about creating beautiful things. It's not that we can't create, and it's not that we can't dream futures, but we need to understand where we are. I call this knowing our place. When I've worked, I'll give you a broad generalization here. I'm thinking this through, but generally when I've been hosting sessions of dreaming and creativity in Indigenous communities, it's very different from the kinds of sessions we host with settlers in North America. I've noticed that the conversations when we're creating new things in Indigenous communities don't start with the kind of limitless imagination that all human beings have. they start with responsibilities and obligations. And often what's named is we have a responsibility to the land, we have a responsibility to our children and grandchildren and future generations, and we have a responsibility to carry the red thread of teachings and culture through. There's a very highly constrained set of obligations that come with creating in a place that you know you're going to continue living for 10,000 years, right? And so I think that there's something about, there's a teaching in that about creativity embedded in the stewardship for the wider context first, and then attending to creative impulse, right? So I think actually one of the reasons why settlers in North America, I mean, let's just think about this for a moment. We talk about belonging and we talk about safety and we talk about a lot of the kinds of things that came up when you guys were doing the 3 words in here. And I need to understand that as settlers in North America, the experience of our safety and our comfort has come at the expense of other people who feel unsafe, who have been displaced, and who are unsettled by our comfort and actions. And I think that, having worked with many immigrants and refugees, and many of you are first generation immigrant and refugees, you will know too that I think you will feel, maybe your experience is different, but especially working with refugees, I've noticed that when they come to North America, they often tell stories about how they experienced more belonging in the refugee camp than they did in the suburbs of North Philadelphia or the places where they were settled when they came. That in North America, we actually have a belonging deficit. We long for home, we long for community, but this is actually the continent of alienation. Settlers are cut off from these lands, are cut off from a sense of a deep belonging and deep knowing. And that's not to say that we don't feel at home here. People do deeply feel at home here. But I think there's a shadow that kind of pervades the North American sense of belonging. And it means we never really can belong here as settlers. So what ends up passing for home, if you think about it, home is like these ephemeral things, like home is where the heart is, or home is where I hang my hat, or, home is all bound in the kind of relationships, but it moves around, but we don't often talk about the sense of obligation and responsibility. When you spend time in Indigenous communities, you realize that the notion of home here for settled Indigenous populations is intimately connected to the cycles of the seasons, to the land, to the animals, to the food, to the teachings, and to the history. So I want to show you something. I live on an island called Nuch Lelachum. Right, so Nuch Lelachum in the Squamish language is the name of the island where I live, and this is it here. It's Bowen Island. It's in Squamish Tmeoch. And the settlers that live here on Bowen Island, like my friend Tun, and there's a few others, Susan, who's here today, and Levin, who's here today. These are my friends and neighbors who live on this island. They can look out and they can name the bodies of water. If I look out from where I'm sitting right now, I can name the Queen Charlotte Channel that separates Bowen Island from West Vancouver. We can maybe name the Collingwood Channel, and we can look at the mountains of the North Shore and the Brunswick Range that extend down the eastern flank of Howe Sound, called Atal Katsum in Squamish language. And people can name some of those peaks, and sometimes we get them wrong. This is a view from Bowen Island, from the causeway, looking over what's called Manion Bay, or in Squamish, Kolakwo. And it looks across the water towards these peaks of the Brunswick Range. And you can see here that there's these kinds of lumpy peaks. And a lot of Bowen Islanders think that these 2 peaks are the Lions, right? You know the Lions in Vancouver, right? You're familiar with the Lions. In fact, that peak is the West Lion, and you can't see the East Lion from Vancouver, from Bowen Island, but you can see them both from Vancouver. But you may know that in the Squamish language, the lions are called the sisters. The twin sisters are called Chichiwai, and Chichiwai are the twin sisters commemorate peace that the daughters of a chief, the twin daughters of a chief, brought between the northern tribes and the Squamish Nation. And they brought these 2 tribes together and they created a peace treaty. And to honor that, they were emblazoned in the physical landscape. Squamish territory is soaked in teachings. When you look out, when settlers look out here, we can name some of these mountain peaks, Mount Townsend, Mount Harvey, Mount Brunswick, maybe some of these other ones. Every single physical feature, every island, every stream, many big rocks are full of teachings, because during the myth time, transformer figures traveled through this landscape, taking things and people and turning them into teachings. The teachings and stories and living histories of the characters are encoded into the landscape, and they tell you how to live in this place. So the lions are actually sisters, and the sisters actually brought peace. And I've often wondered what it would be like if the Canadian Football League team in Vancouver was named after the proper name of those mountains and called the BC Sisters. I think that would be like a really fabulous name for a gridiron football team. Or if the Lionsgate Bridge was actually named the Peace Bridge, or if all of the stuff that was associated with British colonization and these lions proudly sitting over Vancouver was actually rendered as the two sisters who brought peace between warring tribes and created a place of reconciliation. You know, since Vancouver was born as a city, those sisters have watched it and they have had their name stolen from them. And we've created under the shadow of lions and not sisters, not peacemakers. I think it strikes me that although people in Vancouver or Howe Sound here on Bowen Island feel a strong sense of attachment and belonging to a landscape, it's an authentic feeling. But it's actually kind of a shallow and diaphanous impersonation of what Indigenous people feel here. The sense of home is what separates Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Many Indigenous languages are verb-based, and so there are words that sit in Indigenous languages like ke and dene, which refers to the connection you have with people in your clan or family, or anedmoganic in Anishinaabemowin, which is really sometimes translated as all my relations, but as an elder one time scolded me, she said, it really means you belong to everything. She says, you have to get your ego out of it. They're not all yours, right? All my relations. It's like the possessive isn't there. It's you actually belong to everything. Belonging isn't a feeling. And I think this is a place where we get into issues in North America. We have a feeling of belonging. I feel like I belong here. But belonging isn't a thing you can claim. Belonging is the art of being claimed, is the act of being claimed by a place and by a community. So I remember one time working with former National Chief Sean Atleo, and we were doing some work redesigning the Child and Family Services system in the early 2000s. He's from Ahousaht, which is in Clayoquot Sound off the west coast of Vancouver Island. And he wasn't raised there, so he used to come back there from time to time as he was growing up. And as you grow up, you know how it is, like the elders are like, they don't recognize you year after year. And so he would be met at the government dock where the water taxi was coming in, and the elders would look at him. And he said they would always ask him, whose are you? Which I love as an expression. Whose are you? And at some point he would answer, you know, who his father was, who his grandmother was, who his uncles and aunts were. And then they were like, okay, we've got you. We claim you, you know. And so that's how you know you belong. I lived here, I moved to British Columbia in 1994 with my partner, Caitlin, who's also here. And that's a little more than half my life ago. In fact, we marked Caitlin was raised in South Africa and then also moved here when she was younger, but she's been on the coast longer than I have. And we marked my halfway point where I'd spent half my life on the West Coast, that just back in March. And I posted something on my Facebook page that said, hey, I'm a West Coaster now, you know? And all my West Coast Indigenous friends just like filled the page with side-eye comments and like, oh, really? You know, and all these like funny little memes of owls swiveling their heads going, you are, you know, you've been here 26 years, way to go, you know? So I spent a lot of time working with settlers to understand what Indigenous people mean when they say traditional territory. I find myself hosting a lot of the angst and anxiety around the feelings of home. The traditional territories are not just a place where Indigenous people formerly roamed. These are real, present, extant lands and countries. They are borders that delineate lands from one another. They've never been ceded, surrendered, or disposed of. And all First Nations, from the very beginning of contact with Europeans, have asserted this ownership, but it's never gone away. There was never a moment when people said, you know what, you're right, you win. There has always been people saying, these are our lands, these are our lands, these are our lands. There's been a constant petition, I think, that's rung in the ears of settlers and settler governments who did, you know, nevertheless, did their utmost to quiet the din that reminded them that the refusal to engage in, you know, meaningful and creative relationships was unjust and perpetuated a crime. They always knew, I think, that the colonial project was fundamentally wrong. It was founded on unjust principles, the idea of terra nullius, the idea of white supremacy, the idea that Indigenous people were less than, that North American civilization was better than. I think John Ralston once pointed out that the idea that civilization could be measured by whether or not a culture had a wheel was ridiculous in North America. There is no reason why you would have a wheel in North America. But if you look at the canoe and boat technologies of North America, the ocean-going canoes, the river canoes, the lake canoes that people built and crafted here, these are absolute geniuses of transportation technology, absolute geniuses of creativity. Of course, people didn't have the wheel. What would you do with a wheel in North America, in a continent that's like entirely covered and surrounded by water? So I think it's like really understanding this, because when indigenous folks who I work with, who are working to transform systems, and they've just been. I think it's like looking at the difference. The ideas of home are the difference between a well-tended garden, which is very important to us on the Gulf Islands. Our gardens are very critical. We're very proud of our gardens, and what it feels like to walk in an old growth forest. That's the difference between these feelings of home. It's like I love my garden, right? But when I go into an old growth forest, I have no words. I have no words for the depth of awe that I feel at seeing 1,000 or 2,000-year-old cedar trees, at seeing the richness of the undergrowth, at being able to lift the loam into your fingers and know that the mycelial networks there are thousands of years old and have sustained life and have been born from salmon traveling from Japan, who deposited ocean nitrogen into that forest floor, supported the biggest trees on earth. My kale and my butterfly bush, sort of pale in comparison. And even though I love my garden, can you imagine what it feels like to have thousands of generations of your family tend to a forest that becomes so healthy that it actually serves the oxygen needs of the earth, right? That's what we're talking about, the difference between home. Let me show you another thing. I think this is kind of cool. I want you to guess, actually, what this is a map of. Can just put in the chat really quickly. What do you see here? What's this a map of? Real quick. Go. Anybody? Some ideas? Let's see how many different perspectives we can get. Watersheds, yeah, west coast of BC. Territories, language groups, indigenous tribes, islands, indigenous territories. Lands claimed by settlers. Great. Awesome. You are wrong. This was a setup. You are completely wrong. You know what these are? A few years ago, I was actually about 15 years ago, I was doing some work with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And we had a map like this up on the wall. Because what these actually are salmon genetics. These are what are called conservation units in fisheries. And these are basically different salmon families. So salmon that are from these different genetic origins can kind of spawn in different streams in these territories. Okay, they're related and they're kind of like cousins, salmon cousins. And if you're a salmon and you come from the blue area, you really can't, you're not going to go to the purple area. That's a different family, different genetic stream. And what's really interesting is that we had these maps all over the place, and we put them up all over the room. And an indigenous language teacher in Prince George one day walked into the room, and she was looking at all of these maps. What's the point of having people guess? Just to see what you thought. But this is the cool thing, is that she came in there and she said the same thing as you guys said. She said, "Oh, look, you have a map of indigenous territories." And I said, no, these are a map of salmon genetic. And then I caught myself and I went of course it's a map of indigenous territories. The salmon and indigenous cultures are genetically entwined on this coast. This is like the deepest sense of home. If you don't know who you are, just ask the salmon. You can see here that these borders, and it looks like watersheds. Okay, that makes sense that watersheds and cultures might share the same place, but there are a few borders that are quite interesting. Like this one is not a watershed border. And this one is not a watershed border. That's the Cayucot Peninsula. This is a border between the Nuchalnup tribes, who occupy all of this purple land, and Kwakwala-speaking people, Kwakwak people, who occupy all of this land. And this is pretty much the border of Coast Salish folks, and that is most of Squamish territory. The salmon and the cultures overlap. Right. And if this language teacher hadn't pointed it out, we wouldn't have noticed it. And it, I think, later became the focus of somebody's PhD research to go oh my God, you've lived here long enough that the salmon have evolved their own cultures alongside the people who have also evolved their own cultures. So when indigenous people on the west coast of Canada, of North America, talk about being salmon people, they're not wrong. This is an amazing map, right? And this is really talks about the depth of home that we see here. So anybody that feels like traditional territories and all this stuff, it's like, what does it really mean? This is the depth of home and belonging we're talking about. Indigenous folks who live in this part of the world are rooted in this place in a way that is like almost unimaginable for all of us. So what does this all have to do with creativity? So I just want to kind of like take it there. So a lot of the time working in this space between Indigenous and non-Indigenous systems, we've known that, I guess, the answer to reconciliation, the answer to moving past this, is to actually unsettle. The work of settlers, I'll always say, the work of settlers is to be permanently unsettled. Because the work that we need to do as Canadians is to come into a place where we're in relationship with one another. And you can't be in relationship if you're comfortable. All right. We know this as creative people, right? We work with groups of people. We open up all these innovative brainstorming sessions, and we unsettle people. People walk into the rooms in the innovation labs where we're working, and they're like, oh, I'm not so super comfortable here. And we're like, cool, we can create something when you're in that place. Like the reason I asked Tun to come and play was because Tun's not only my friend, I mean, he lives 200 meters away. So, you know, he's part of the furniture in my home, but he's also my teacher, my jazz teacher. And in teaching me jazz, I've played music for 42 years. And if you've read my bio, you'll see I was spectacularly unsuccessful in learning guitar to the extent that I could form a band with Freddie Mercury and Brian May when I was 12 years old, but it didn't stop me from trying. My musical career has been really largely about playing folk music and making myself comfortable in the music that I play. And learning jazz has completely unsettled me. I was so glad that Tun chose to play All the Things You Are, because All the Things You Are includes these shifts, and you know, the rug gets ripped out from under you as you're trying to play a solo, and suddenly the key has changed. And that unsettling is where creativity comes from. And so I actually think that the permanent job of settlers in North America is to unsettle. And I think creative people have a role to play in creating this new country that we are living in fulfilling the promise of relationship that has been extended from the beginning by Indigenous people who said, hey, who are you guys? You look cool. Do you want to do something interesting together? And at every turn, we turned away and said, no, we've got our own ideas. We're pretty set on what we're going to do here. Thanks anyway. And in fact, we're going to move you off. But creative people know that you can't create without being unsettled. So how can we bring our skills in the service of creative reconciliation? How can we help people get unsettled about the realities that are coming to light as these graves are discovered, as these babies are coming back to tell us the truth, and stay in that place? Because staying in that place of being unsettled actually allows us to create the home that's always been promised here, right? Not to seek comfort, not to seek safety, but to seek the discomfort, to seek the off-centeredness, to seek all of that that puts us into relationship with one another again. And I believe in dialogue, and I believe in collaboration, and I believe in creativity, but it can't come if one person is settled and knows what the answer is, and everybody else is scrambling around to try and appease them. So I think, if anything, that's my call to action. And I think I'll kind of leave it there. But I do think that our climate future, our social relationships, the impacts of economic inequality, nothing will get done based on what we already know. These are complex challenges that require us all to step out and to become unsettled. This is what Indigenous people have been asking us to do since time immemorial, since the time Europeans first arrived. Don't be so sure of yourself. Don't think you know everything when you're here. Let's create together. Get unsettled and let's create together. So humble ourselves, listen, be led into these almost like sacred spaces of co-creative relationship. They shimmer through Indigenous cultures and Indigenous teachings. And if we first acknowledge where we are and we learn to know our place, know the names of our place, but also know what our place is here, and we pay attention to what's being asked of us, I think we can direct creative energies, tools, and practices into a really promising future. I'm a born optimist, right? I think we can create thriving landscapes, powerful host cultures leading us that way, a strong and dignified sense of what it means to be a respected guest in somebody else's home. So there's a moment here, and I think we need to find a way to seize it. Thanks.
And here is, let's come back to question and conversation. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. As I have mentioned, I'm a new, I have some questions as well. People, anybody that have questions, please put it in the chat. Mark, please help me to put, to choose some of the questions for Chris.
You betcha. We have a couple already. I'm going to start with Lillian and Hillary. I'm going to ask you to unmute and add you. There you are. Welcome.
Hi.
That Hillary. Hello, Hillary. Hi, Lillian.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm just so moved. That map brought me to tears. I yearn for that type of home. And I yearn to come into right relationship. And I notice within myself that I have been cultured to be settled, to approach the world with confidence, to have the answer, to think things through as deeply as possible, and, you know, come up with the answer often too independently and not without doing all of the work to research and to glean knowledge from others, particularly from elders and knowledge keepers of this land. I'm in Coetzen territory. So I would love your tips on how to catch myself, how to unlearn that habit, what the practice might be for deepening that skill.
Well, there's no substitution from being publicly scolded by a grandmother. So if you can actually get yourself in a situation where you make the fatal mistake of showing up somewhere thinking you know what you're talking about and a grandmother takes a strip off you, you will never unlearn that. But if you want to avoid those kinds of situations, you know, do what I do and have it happen like 30 or 40 times, and then realize that it's just okay to ask. It's just okay to say, like, I don't know what to do here. It's even okay to say, as I've had an experience. I had an experience one time where I was facilitating with far too much certainty. This was in Hawaii with Indigenous Hawaiians and Americans, and the whole thing just collapsed. It's a very long story, but at the end of it, I turned to my one of my Indigenous partners, and I said to her, Miley, I'm afraid and I don't know what to do. Right. And I was keeping like trying to be defensive and come up with solutions. I'm afraid and I don't know what to do. And she said, finally we can work together. Because you know what? As a Hawaiian, I've been afraid ever since you people arrived. And I don't know what to do either. Right. And it's like that common ground. That's really helpful. So it takes some scolding to be able to learn that. It takes some hard being in hard places to be able to learn that. But that was, to me, one of the biggest teachings I've ever had about, like, just be unsettled and stay unsettled, right? Yeah. So good luck with that. May you be scolded by a granny. That would be my blessing for you.
We have another question from Shiraz. Shiraz, go ahead and unmute yourself and come join us.
Oh, can you unmute yourself, Shiraz, so we can hear you?
I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Can hear you now.
Yeah, my question is about reciprocity. What do you think is the role of reciprocity in terms of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people? Because I find creativity is reciprocity, because your mother creates you and then you are reciprocating by showing all your talents to the community and so on. So I just want to hear your comment. And because to me, I've grown up in Canada, I feel reciprocity is more patriotism or militarism, that unless you join the army, you are not Canadian. But I think with First Nation, reciprocity is such a powerful message. Thank you.
I agree with you. I think I've learned over the years that reciprocity and relationality are the two things that when they're at play, then we're really working. An organization that we work with called the Circle on Aboriginal People and Philanthropy. And oh, you know what, you guys, you need to get Chris Archie to do one of these talks. So Chris Archie is the CEO of that organization. And we used to do a workshop with them to teach people participatory leadership and dialogue. And it was called The Art of Hosting Active Reconciliation. And, you know, you may have noticed in the last couple of years, we've just we've just stopped using, or at least Indigenous people have stopped using the word reconciliation, because it is deeper than that. Reconciliation is kind of, I don't know, it's like we're a long way from that. We need to get to the truth part first. But the way to get into that truth part first is the reciprocity piece. And so I think we now call the workshop the art of active reciprocity. And it's like, how do we build relationships that begin that cycle of reciprocity and gift giving and receiving and returning, that build the relationships and actually create the social glue that we need to even begin to think about what reconciliation means. Chris Archie's organization is called The Circle, on philanthropy with Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And we can look for that website, maybe post it in the chat. But they do amazing, amazing work, transforming and decolonizing wealth and philanthropy. And it's powerful, powerful. I just want to lift Chris up. She's an incredible human being. And this is a really, really meaningful initiative that was started by a number of foundations in Canada, and is really creating the potential to transform and understand how to use wealth in the service of reciprocity.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the talk, and thank you, too, for hosting. I just had a question regarding listening and like the act of like listening and you know, all the dialogue, the relationship building that you've been doing, Chris, because you know, sometimes I find it hard, like for deep, you know, connecting on like the deep level and that element of reciprocity we just spoke about. I think we go, you know, there's that point that needs to go even like beyond listening. But sometimes even like myself, I see myself and I'm like, you know, like, yes, I you know, I have my issues and I would like to be reciprocity, but you know, I think listening is like takes such a huge space, and I want to be that person to listen and not to just be in the space and take the space, but you know, just being there and giving it. But where do you see that kind of balance in these kind of, you know, very specific relationship building around reciprocity, of both listening, but also being able to share and to have that common ground, as you were talking about, like unsettling yourself in order to have a common ground. So yeah, I don't know if you get the question, but.
Yep, well, I can a little bit. So here's an exercise you can try. Go into a wild place away from the city, go into a forest or sit on a beach or something. But forest is a really good place to do this. And just go and sit still in the forest, right? And start listening to what you hear around you. And what happens is when we go into forests as human beings, if we don't know the forest and the forest doesn't know us, we actually create this bubble around us, right? And animals will flee, and like there's this bubble where everything is nervous because we're here, okay? And when you sit there in the forest and you just take your seat on the ground and you begin to listen, you'll notice that the forest closes back in around you, right? And it's at that moment that you'll start hearing bird song, or you'll start seeing animals, or you'll start seeing things that are going on in the forest, because you become a part of it. You become, in a sense, claimed by the forest. And so you might be able to walk through a forest going, oh, I love this place and I really belong here, but you never belong until you're claimed. And so there's a level of listening that happens for me about, it's not just walking through the forest and listening to birdsong, but sitting there and really deeply allowing the forest to own you, and then listening from that place. And that takes longer than you think. I mean, it's 20 minutes in a forest, but when you're working in a community, right, it's a lot longer. But to kind of sit in a place, to be there long enough. And this is the problem with settlers. We move around. Go west, young man. You know, like, you don't like it here, get up and go somewhere else. And we never sit still long enough to really listen to what the salmon are saying with their genes, what the transformers said when they made the sisters instead of lions up on top of the mountains. You know, when we can sit long enough in a place, you start hearing things differently, right? And then, you know, maybe there is common ground and maybe there isn't common ground. Maybe that's what we need to discover, you know? Sometimes the diversity is what we need to hear, and sometimes it's common ground. But I don't think we're really truly listening until we're claimed by that place, in a sense, you know, at a deeper level, and then we allow ourselves to be transformed. And I think that's true in conversation, in dialogue, but I also think it's true in the bigger work of social justice, of the creative transformation of our societies and economies and relationships.
Appreciate that so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question. It's a great question. It's a lifelong practice too, right?